James Ingram, welcome back.
Thanks for having me back again. It's a pleasure to come back again.
It's very good to see you again. Just to provide a bit of context for viewers, so you were on the program a few months ago, and that episode got quite a strong reaction, a very positive reaction. And I was amazed by the number of questions that viewers had for you and just the amount of engagement that resulted from that episode. So we thought it would be interesting to continue the discussion and also to go into some areas that we briefly touched upon, but could have explored in greater depth the first time around. So why don't we start there? So there were a couple of things that I wanted to discuss on this episode. The first was if we could go into more depth about the issues of notation. Now, just again, to provide a bit of context for people who might be joining us for the first time. So James is a composer and also an expert on music notation and on music engraving. And that was, in fact, your sort of primary professional activity for most of your career. And in addition to that, you happen to bear witness to one of the most extraordinary times in contemporary music when you entered the employment of Stockhausen in the 1970s. And so you witnessed all of this firsthand. But I thought it would be interesting to talk about the development of music notation and the collapse of the sort of avant-garde notational project that was that really defined a lot of the work of the musical avant-garde in the 1950s and 1960s. If we think about things like the open form notations developed by Earl Brown and Andrei Bukarestiev, Stockhausen, Boulez.
Also the attempts to invent new notations in the 60s.
Absolutely.
To get away from standard notation.
Absolutely, which is a very prominent feature of Cage's work. Moderna also, so many, Berio, Feldman, so many figures were going into that direction at the same time. So let me start with this. What do you think was the problem that they were all trying to solve? Because this happened. This happened in the work of many composers simultaneously in many different countries. So there was clearly something that they felt that standard notation was not adequate for. So what was that thing?
I think the problem was that they thought of standard notation as being perfectly accurate. It was what you wrote on the paper is what you were supposed to hear. So if you invented a new notation, it was supposed to sound the way the notation looked. If you think, for example, of Bussotti, sort of completely wild graphics on notation, and then they were given to performers in order to make music which sounded different. But just because the notation looks different, the music doesn't sound different. So they had a misconception in the 50s and 60s that music notation could be divorced from performance practice. That music notation is something absolute, and standard notation, which evolved during the 19th century, it describes an absolute space and time in 19th century concepts, which didn't work. If you try to ignore performance practice, as Stravinsky did, or the neoclassicists in the first half of the century, you end up with something very boring. It all begins to sound like march music or also Hindemith Tempo 100. And I think that the post-war generation, the generation of the post-Second World War generation, was reacting against this static nature of tempo. They didn't understand tempo. They thought it was still thinking of tempo as being absolute, and that the standard notation was actually describing something perfect, and that if they invented a different notation, then the notation would sound different. But that's not the way it works.
That's not the way it works. Okay, so the problem they were trying to solve was there was a broad international project to renew the nature and the techniques and the styles and the aesthetics of musical composition.
Well, they were trying to make something sound different. They were trying to get away from the sounds of Stravinsky and the neoclassics. I mean, Hindemith and late Schoenberg and these things. They were trying to make something sound freer.
Right.
Trying to get away from this freedom. And the way to get away from this freedom from the neoclassics avoid difficult tuplets. And so the way they thought they could get away from this rigid tempo structure, which had no performance practice, you're supposed to do what's on the page. The way to get away from that was to reintroduce tuplets, arbitrary triplets, which is why Stockhausen started with in the piano piece 2. You get sort of 17 against 10 or whatever it is, and this is supposed to free you from sounding like Hindemith.
What I remember Stockhausen saying about that, I'd love to get your perspective on this, and it's particularly dramatic in the first 4 Klavierstücke, is he points out that the corporeal rhythms that we experience as a fundamental dimension of our being, and that we experience from not only from birth, but even before that, and during gestation, is a continuous polyrhythm of different periodicities. The heartbeat, the flow of blood, all the different corporeal rhythms. Sorry, I'm going to get this right. That are going on simultaneously and that are not synchronized with each other. And that his notation was an attempt to bring it back and get away from these sort of rigid, iterative march rhythms.
But he still has a unifying tempo. I mean, in the piano pieces, there's always a tempo which you're supposed to start with, and which you refer to, and that tempo is always you can do it with a metronome.
Right.
So he doesn't actually get away from that.
Right.
I think we touched on it last time, apropos Ferneyhough, that the way to perform the piano pieces, I mean, Stockhausen's early piano pieces, where these complicated tuplets, Stockhausen would say the way to do that is to replace them all with different tempi, but you first have to learn the ground tempo. So Stockhausen assumed that everybody would have to learn to play exact tempi.
Right.
Right. But that's not the way it works. If you record the pieces exactly the way they're written, and then transfer that to your brain, and you listen to how it sounds, and then try to reproduce that, that's one step further than going just to the tempo. You don't have to remember the tempo; you have to remember how the piece sounds. Which is what I'm saying. I mean, Stockhausen goes down to the level of tempo and then stops there. But I'm saying that you have to go another level down.
Well, what a lot of these different notations have in common, some of them we should point out also were a lot more radical than others. So there were some notations that did away completely with the 5-line staff, which implies not only getting away from periodic rhythms and meter, but also from conventional systems of notating pitch. That's the case with Earl Brown and Feldman and Cage, notably.
But that doesn't work either, does it?
That also has...
I mean, it can work, but... spatial, the information you put on the page has no direct correspondence to what you actually hear, to the temporal information. So if you're working out a piece and use a completely different kind of notation, it can always be transcribed into something that looks like standard notation, because standard notation has evolved over hundreds of years to be very efficient. There are levels of encapsulation. One can see a system, and then in a Haber system you can see a bar, and in a Haber bar you can see the event symbols, and within the event symbols there are groups of symbols connected by beams, and that allows you to make a mental picture of what you're supposed to do. And it's very easy to read because, I mean, everybody reads it because it's been in use for the last few centuries. But it doesn't mean that the symbols have a single meaning. as the post Second World War generation thought. The meanings are arbitrary. They have to be learnt, and they are part of the performance practice.
Yeah. Well, some of these notations again are very radical. An example that I like to give is the Concert for Piano and Orchestra by Cage, which is extreme in terms of not only just the divergence from standard notation, but also the wealth of different strategies for notating notating his ideas. But then there are also composers like Penderecki, for example, or Lutoslawski, who retain most of the elements of classical notation, but just change a couple of things. But what's striking to me is that by about the 70s, it does seem as though that project of renewing music through and partially through renewing notation had collapsed, broadly speaking. So Feldman made the switch from his graph notation to basically a completely classical system of notation. Boulez's experiments with open form notation in pieces like Domaine and the Third Piano Sonata were over by then. Stockhausen also left the sort of Aus den Sieben Tagen era and moved back to mantra and Inori and conventionally notated pieces. And Cage moves towards things like the Freeman Etudes, which they're unusual, obviously, but they're also, in most of their dimensions, classically notated. So there seems to have been a mass exodus away from...
but they didn't solve any of the problems. They just sort of gave up.
So it was an admission of failure as far as you're concerned.
For me, it was an admission of failure.
Okay.
I actually made the score of Feldman's Viola in My Life No. 3.
Oh, yes.
Which is very interesting. Viola and piano. And in that piece, I was looking at it the other day, some bars are written, he changes the tempo sometimes for a bar, so you lose the feeling of tempo. And sometimes he would, for single bars, he would put a tuplet in. But you can't actually, it doesn't actually make sense. It's also very interesting, if you look at the score, you can see that he doesn't really believe what he's writing. I mean, he knows what he wants to hear. He was an incredible composer, very, very good composer. But the notation actually doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't make sense. Well, in fact, this has been a subject of conversation with a number of people I've been speaking with recently. There's a piece called Neither by Feldman, which is a monodrama for soprano and orchestra based on a short text by Samuel Beckett. And that piece is notated in such a manner as to completely frustrate the work of the conductor. It makes it almost impossible because his notation system internally is completely incoherent. I think intentionally so, although it's difficult to figure out to what degree he was attempting to frustrate normal performance practices or to what degree he simply hadn't worked out all of the problems.
Well, the thing is that even in, I'm still talking about number 3, he still thinks that there is an exact correspondence between what he's writing and what he's going to hear. I mean, if you assume that you can do exact tempi, then you can play it right. You can play it correctly. But that's a wrong assumption. And you can't tell the difference. If somebody plays 61.3 instead of 62, or whatever it was, it's not going to make any difference to what you hear. I mean, it may, but I mean, you won't be able to tell the difference. Let's put it that way. So it's the problems are not solved. They're just put on one side. I mean, he's just brushed it to one side. He hasn't actually solved the problem of performance practice in the concept of notation itself.
Right. Well, he wrote and spoke at length about the problems with graph notation. One of which was that he says that his intention had been to liberate sound, but what actually happened is he liberated the performer.
Yeah.
Right, which is not what he wanted. And the performers were free.
The performers have to learn the way he wanted to do it.
Right.
In rehearsals. So they learned to do what he wanted, which is not what's on the paper.
Right. And I've been also working on this question with one of my composition students who's very interested in open forms and modular forms of music, in which you get away from this sort of highly directional approach to music, and you can write little short fragments that can be put together in different orders. And one of the problems with that approach, and he's very aware of this, is the fact that in a sense it's a false dichotomy, because it looks free and non-determined on the page, but from the perspective of the audience, it's a completely conventional piece, because the audience just hears it in a straight line from beginning to end, and they don't see the score. What the score happens to look like is of no significance to them.
Oh, that's right.
So what you what you end up with is a piece that starts at the beginning and goes to the end, even though the score might look a little bit different.
Well, that was another thing that was very fashionable in the 60s. I remember Poussin's Votre Faust, which was a score with windows cut in, and I forget exactly how it works, but it's a mobile score. I mean, the mobile scores were a thing in the 60s, where you could actually, Stockhausen had piano pieces that you can play in any order, the fragments.
Number 11, yes.
Yeah, and things like that. The audience just hears it in one direction. Mm-hmm. And, Stockhausen made versions of refrain later, much later. Because there are three best versions of refrain where the gliding transparency where you put the trills is in a different place, and he just decided, well, let's make three scores and let them do it like that.
Right.
But, so it's not a mobile scores were not a mistake, but didn't go anywhere.
No, it doesn't work. And in the case of Boulez, as you know, he was very interested in and influenced by Mallarmé, and a particular project of Mallarmé's, which was never published during the poet's lifetime, called the Livre, which is a book of poetry without any binding. So you get these sheets of paper, presumably delivered in a box, that can be put into any arbitrary order. And for a reader, and that does make a certain amount of sense, because you have these loose leaves, right? And you can put them in any order and you can shuffle them around. But it doesn't make sense for someone listening to a piece of music. And what Boulez realized in the case of his third piano sonata was that as he would work on it with performers, he would realize, well, putting that fragment next to this one doesn't work. It would work better this way. And then you eventually realize, well, there is actually an order that's optimal. Yeah. And then he would think, well, why not just write it that way?
Then write it that way.
Right.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, the box reminds me of Duchamp's Green Box. It's a very much earlier example of something which is not a fixed thing. So it had its history in 20th century art.
Yes, or the mobiles of Alexander Calder.
Those sorts of things. But in the case of music, we are talking about something which goes from A to B, and goes from beginning to end, and there's no reason why you shouldn't actually make the optimal version.
Right. Okay. So your vision of this is that fundamentally that project failed.
Yeah.
And the composers all, in their various ways, recognized that.
Yeah.
And eventually retreated back to, in most cases, a totally conventional form of notation.
Not exactly totally conventional, but at least based on standard notation. I mean, because standard notation, everybody can read it, and it just saves time in rehearsals when everybody knows what they can read. Where you can refer to the third, eighth note in the fourth bar of page 3. And if you've just got graphics and you can't say the third squiggle, the one that's a bit bigger than and then you end up losing a lot of time.
That's right. There's a Leonard Bernstein performance of one of Feldman's graph pieces with the New York Philharmonic, and I think it's an amazing document, this recording. But I have to wonder what the rehearsals were like. Because it's this row of boxes specifying low, medium, or high sounds, and then it'll specify approximate performance indications, but the pitches and rhythms are stcompletely non-determined. So how do you rehearse a piece like that?
Exactly. And I mean, I'm thinking, going back to Stockhausen, the plus-minus pieces that he was working with, which he used in Osaka in the World Ausstellung, that's also very difficult to, I mean, they are prescriptions for a score. I mean, it would be better if they were just worked out. And if you have to increase 4 parameters at once, then it's better to, as a composer, to actually say which parameters are you going to increase and which by how much, rather than just leaving the piece in a sort of a kind of unfinished mobile, as a kind of unfinished description.
Right.
So and it just takes a lot of time. And if you rehearse a piece like Polo or Expo, which are written with plus minus notation, it just takes the performer a lot of time to work out what they're going to do. And I defy anybody to actually do it live in performance. And even if they did, nobody's going to know what they're doing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we are back to describing music in terms of event symbols. Mm-hmm. I mean, actually, this event does this.
Right.
And you have to go down to that level.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Right. So that project failed, and in your view, rather than attempting to solve it, they sort of brushed it aside. So do you think it's a solvable problem? Because there are also practical considerations that come into this. As you just said, mm-hmm. Ultimately the pieces are going to be played within a professional framework. Yeah. They have to be rehearsed. Mm-hmm. You have practical, pragmatic constraints that you have to deal with. Yeah. And so if the performers have to deal with a completely novel system of notation, it's going to be a non-starter. So how do you
Well, for me, the answer is to prune the standard notation, get rid of the bits that don't make sense. Uh-huh. And I think the bits that make sense are clefs and 5-line systems and note heads and accidentals. Beams are very useful. They're optically, they bind things together. It tells you which they make words. Mm-hmm. I mean, like in ordinary text, you have words consist of a sequence of letters bunched together, mm-hmm. separated by space. And beams have the same kind of function in when you're reading music. So I think they're very useful. Bar lines, I think bars are very useful. But bars don't have to add up to some kind of. For me, bars have to add up, but not on the graphics level. So you don't. If you can have 7 things that look like crotchets. This is German terminology.
Yes.
The terminology is wrong.
Yeah.
And it's the modern terminology is wrong. The old English terminology is correct. A crochet is a croche. It's a thing like
it's a hook.
It's a hook. Yeah. It's an object that looks like this. Mm-hmm. And a quaver is something that quavers.
Right.
And a minim is a short note. Mm-hmm. And a breve is a bit longer, but a minim is shorter than a breve. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And a semi-breve is half a breve, right, and half a short note. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the old terminology is more correct than the newer American version, mm-hmm. Which comes, I don't know when it's introduced, but probably around the 18th century or something. Mm-hmm. When you start thinking in Newtonian terms, I mean, you start thinking in terms of dividing time, mm-hmm. And which, for me, it doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. You can have a short note and you can have a shorter note, and you can have a crotchet, which is something which is shorter than a shorter note, and you can have a quaver, which is shorter than a crotchet, mm-hmm. but you can't actually say what their relationship is.
That's very interesting. That is that's right. We may have covered this last time, so you'll stop me if I'm repeating myself, but that's one of the central tenets of a book called Music in the 20th Century by Ton de Leeuw, mm-hmm. a Dutch composer and author. And what he talks about is the fact that a lot of the Western European conception of musical notation has to do with, as you say, sort of a Newtonian approach to time, mm-hmm. where you start with a value and then you cut it by half and then by half and by half and by half.
Yeah. But you can do it in space, but you can't do it in time.
Right. Exactly. Whereas his point is that Eastern European musical traditions don't function that way, mm-hmm. Because they retain the idea of a long beat and a short beat, but they're not exact multiples of each other. Right. Mm-hmm. And so in order to make larger phrases, you have to start with the shortest beat unit or the shortest rhythmic value and add it together.
Yeah.
So his vision is that you have divisive rhythms, which is the sort of standard Western European approach. You start with the whole note and so on. And then the Eastern European approach is an additive approach, where you start with a very small unit and you link them together to make larger phrases.
Yeah. I go a little bit further than that, I think. For me, bars add up in milliseconds. I mean, voices add up in milliseconds. And the shortest duration you can perceive is about 2 milliseconds. And so I have symbols which have a graphical appearance, but they have a separate temporal definition, which is embedded in them. And the temporal definition, the duration of the symbol, is defined in milliseconds. And bars have to add up in milliseconds. When you get to the end of the bar, you have to have the same number of milliseconds in each voice, right? But the millisecond is not. I suppose you could call it a tempo, but it's so fast that you can't actually hear it. It's like quantum mechanics, or pixels, pixelated time. So if you think of pixels on a screen, what I'm talking about is, and the pixel on a screen, they're so small you can't actually see them.
Right.
Right? And I'm talking about the same sort of thing in time. You can make additive time with pixelated time. And pixelated time means the shortest duration difference between events is a millisecond.
You would need a new term because the word pixel actually comes from picture element. Right. So so we'd need an equivalent for time.
I'm talking about quantized time.
Quantized time.
Or, pixel is a quantized space.
Right.
And I'm talking about quantized time.
Right.
So there is no point in composing a duration of 3.102 1046 milliseconds because you can't hear anything smaller than a millisecond. So you have quantized time, which takes the place of a tempo, but you can't actually hear the milliseconds.
Okay, so that implies that this notation has to be in phase with our actual perceptual faculty, right? It can't be completely divorced from that.
There's no point in defining things more accurately than to the millisecond.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about that for a sec, because Stockhausen talked about the fact that there are perceptual thresholds that are real. And I don't know if it was with Meyer Epler that he got these concepts from. I don't know, but he talks about the fact that in distinguishing very similar but slightly different pitches, for example, there's a threshold for that. There's a threshold beyond which nobody can tell the difference if a sound is slightly higher or slightly lower. And he also talks about that with respect to duration, right? So that anybody can tell a 1-to-2 ratio in duration. You can play them a sound that's 1 second long and a sound that's 2 seconds long. It's very easy to tell which one is longer.
But if you play half a millisecond and a millisecond, you can't tell the difference.
Right.
It's a click.
That's right. Or a more complex ratio like 10 to 11, for example. It's impossible. So, which sort of implies that he was aware of these perceptual thresholds and that he was taking them into account in his music. All right. So how would you go about solving this problem? So there are multiple constraints. It has to be something that is practical, that can exist within the professional world. It has to take account of human perception. But it also has to open up.
Be flexible enough.
It has to be flexible.
Well, you have to. Let's say you've got a bar of 4 seconds long, and that means you've got 4,000 milliseconds, places where you can potentially start or end a note, right, or an event. I can put it anywhere. Right? That means I am flexible, but I don't need to be more precise than 4,000. There are 4,000 places I can put the note in any voice, and all the voices have to add up to 4,000 milliseconds. But these are integers, so they're not rational numbers. And so, from the beginning of the bar at millisecond 322, I can put a note. I can say the first note is 322 milliseconds, and then the next one starts. that means that I'm as flexible as I need to be with respect to my perception, and it's flexible enough for anybody. You don't need to do any bit more precise than that, and you don't need rational numbers.
So how would this work in practice? Because what you're describing sounds to me like a DAW, or a digital audio workstation, where you can quantize time in milliseconds, and then you can see extremely precisely where an event falls on the timeline.
Yeah.
But how would this work in terms of music notation?
Well, because let's say I have 4 crotchet symbols in this bar of 4,000. They have to add up to 4,000, but they don't all have to be the same length, because their definition is unique to each note. So one of them could be 392 milliseconds. The next one could be 403. So they can, but they're all crotchets, because the definition tells you how long they are, what their duration is.
So, all right. So as long as everybody has a coordinated landing point, let's say.
Yeah. Well, the bars have to add up.
The bars have to add up. But but so you're saying within the bars, the notes don't all have to be an identical duration.
That's right.
It accounts for.
Let's say we've got a Viennese waltz. Okay. Well, so I can record a Viennese waltz in this notation. We're using ordinary symbols, the ordinary graphics, but the what is it? Dum 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 da dum dum. The second one's longer.
That's right. Yeah.
So the second one's a bit longer, and which is, and I just say how many milliseconds I want it to be. So you can actually record an exact recording of a recording of a Viennese waltz that's as exact as it needs to be.
Okay, so let me talk about that for a second. So what you're describing is the fact that if you notate a Viennese waltz, it's going to look like dum bum 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 bum. It's going to look like that, but of course that's not how they play it.
No.
And the reason they don't play it like that is first of all, it has to do with the dance steps, the fact that you
have to turn around.
You have to turn around, and it takes a certain amount of time to do that,
Yeah.
so that the beats are not all equal. Now, of course, if you're in that context, culturally, and you understand the dance, and you understand the style, you'll do all of this instinctively. So the notation, in a sense, isn't burdened with having to.
No, but then you
reflect.
have to. I mean, you don't need to know. I mean, because the performance of a Viennese waltz is a performance practice that you have learned. You don't need to be told that again when you're reading it. You just need to know which pitches I'm supposed to be playing at this point, and then the rhythms you do yourself. And because you know how to play it, how each bar is supposed to proceed. And what I'm saying is that it's quite possible to define the lengths of these crotchet symbols exactly, even different performances. I mean, you could have the same score with different performances at different recorded inside the same score. One could be a slower version of the. I mean, the bar may not be 4,000 milliseconds long, so 4,020, or it could be 4,078 or something. It should be anything, but it has to add up. So the vertical line comes at a particular point.
Okay. So I'm completely on board with you about the need to think about these questions very carefully. There's one. What would you say? There's one objection that one might raise, which is that in general, people are not so concerned with there being a total philosophical and technical coherence within a system. Most people are pragmatists in the sense that they want it to work well enough, even if it has some internal inconsistencies. So unless there's...
but you can't have software that has internal inconsistencies.
Right,
So if you're going to use software, you have to be consistent. But the job of the software to give you the flexibility you need.
Right, okay.
So it has to be internally consistent.
Right, I see. Okay, so this is again presupposing that the notation...
Presupposing that you're going to use software to actually notate these pieces.
I see, okay.
I mean, if you want to write it on paper, then the whole problem, you're back in the 1960s.
Okay, so that also suggests that the revolution in music notation, which came about as a result of Sibelius software, which was really the first one to be broadly marketed.
Finale.
Finale
I was using Finale.
Lilypad and right, and Score and all of these different platforms. I probably put Sibelius first because I happen to know Jonathan Finn, and so, who struggled, by the way, for years and years to bring Sibelius to the market. It was very difficult, in fact, and it wasn't clear that there would be much of a market at first. But anyway, so that presupposes that the existence of these programs, that you have to rethink your relationship to notation. With respect to Fernyhough, that's someone whose work I've looked at very, very closely, and I admire him tremendously as a figure. It's very interesting that when he started using Patchwork, which is a piece of software developed at IRCAM, I believe, in conjunction with Finale, the notation program, his entire approach to notation changed. And the scores that he was writing in the 1970s used this multi-parametric notation system where there'll be multiple staves, sometimes for a monophonic instrument. So there'll be a staff with rhythms, for the left hand, rhythms for the right hand, rhythms for the breath, and so on. And he completely stopped doing that in the mid-1990s when he moved to using Finale software. Well, it wasn't Finale at the time, but anyway. So, which implies again that the move to a different notational technology had real material consequences for the development of his music.
Yeah, that sounds like it was also a consequence. It's also part of this mobile thought. What do you call it? Thought process. The scores have to be that there is this absolute thing that you can notate on 4 systems that is actually one thing, but it's better to actually keep it on one system if you can.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it has to do with this thing about mobile scores too.
Right. Okay. So you entered the Stockhausen fray, as it were, in the 19. What exact year was it again?
I first moved to Germany in 74.
74. Okay.
Yeah, but I was in contact with him in 73.
Right. So that's after Aus den 7 Tagen and Plus Minus. Okay. So
it was after Mantra.
Okay. Right, after Mantra. So did he ever talk to you about these problems of notation and the effects that it was having on his music?
Well, he would tell me what he thought. I mean, I remember him telling me how he thought the subdivisions in the piano pieces should be thought of as tempo changes. He didn't believe in nested tempos, nested tuplets. I mean, nested tuplets. He thought you could do it by changing tempo instead of thinking you got to have a nested tuplet.
But he didn't notate it that way.
No, at that time he didn't. But he his final opinion was that you could change tempo, but you had to know the tempo.
That's very interesting.
So audiences also have to know the tempo so that they know what you're playing, to actually transfer the information. But I don't believe you can actually transfer information. I don't think you can hear paper. I think what you hear is your experience.
Right. Okay. No, that's fascinating because, well, the notation in the first 4 Klavierstücke is rather unique in that period, I would say.
Yeah.
There aren't any other pieces that are really notated that way. Even the Boulez pieces, the piano sonatas are relatively straightforward. I mean, he doesn't use meter; he uses bar lines without meter, and the beat divisions are eccentric because he has dotted 16ths and dotted 8ths and so on that coexist with. So there are lots of polyrhythms, but basically the notation is pretty straightforward, and he doesn't really abuse tuplets all that much. But so Stockhausen, the tuplets were actually changes of tempi.
Yeah,
that's very interesting because it's not necessarily self-evident when you look at the score.
No. But I mean, that was his later opinion, but I don't think he started out like that. I think at the time he wrote them, he really thought you could actually subdivide subdivisions, because he was using Newtonian time, which could be subdivided ad lib. You can do that in space. There's a geometrical construction for dividing space into equal segments. And then you can divide the equal segments into different equal segments and do what you like. But you can't do that in time.
You know what's interesting also, when you study music notation and engraving, which I did because I worked as a music engraver for about 10 years. I worked for all the big Parisian publishers and I worked for many different composers. You have to learn note spacing, which is tricky because you might assume that the amount of horizontal space allotted to a 16th note would be half what would be allotted to an 8th note. And so on. But of course, it doesn't work that way. It's not. It doesn't work that way. It's not
It's about making things legible,
right,
and increasing the amount of information on the page.
Right.
You have to get enough. You have to maximize the amount of information on the page, as spatial information, while keeping it legible.
Right, but there's a nonlinear correlation.
It has
between...
nothing to do with actual time.
Right.
It's like, I mean, if you're reading an ordinary text, ordinary words, it doesn't tell you anything about the time how fast you're supposed to be reading it. But you still read clumps. You read groups of letters as words, and music is like that. You know, I'm going to read this bar, and you see the bar, and then you grab chunks of it out. You understand this. I mean, if you're reading a classical piece of music, you read an arpeggio, and this is an arpeggio, right? And it's connected with a beam, which tells you that it makes it easier to read.
Right.
It chunks the information. Chunking is an important word.
Right.
Also in philosophy.
Right. So it has to do with parsing information.
Parsing information.
You can divide it into manageable units.
Yeah. But it doesn't have to do with the time. That's just reading.
There's a related concept. This is maybe a bit of a rabbit hole, but I want to briefly talk about this. There's a concept that I learned from a British, later Canadian poet called Steve McCaffrey, a very interesting figure, called booma shapes. And he didn't originate this term. It was I believe, a linguist who came up with it. But booma shapes are if you were to take a word and black it in, right, so that all you see is the outline of the word. You see the ascenders, the descenders, and so on. And give that to someone to read, they can still read it. With surprising accuracy.
I mean, Stockhausen had talks about this with my Epler. I forget what it is now. There's an amount of information that's redundant. Redundancy of information you can. Also, Shannon talks about this with how much information you can remove before it becomes unreadable, and it's quite a lot.
It's quite a lot.
But redundancy is useful. I mean, there are things in about making things legible. I mean, typefaces have serifs. Some have serifs, some don't. And the serifs allow your eye to grapple with it makes it easier to read. If you read the serif if you read Deraille in the 1950s, written with Futura,
yes,
it's quite difficult to read.
Yes,
and if you read Times with serifs on it, it's nicer. It's easier.
That's right. It's brilliant for signage on highways. It's very fun to go into Switzerland because all of the public signage is in Helvetica.
Right.
But it works less well as a typeface.
As a reading block text, you need serifs. You need irritants.
Right.
You need irritants for your eyes to grab these little things.
That's right.
And so that's all about legibility.
So, okay, that redundancy idea is very interesting. It also relates to one of the central difficulties of the Second Viennese School for listeners, which is that it's as though you took the sort of Brahmsian developing variation concept, the sort of constant development of ideas, and then Wagnerian chromaticism. You put them together and you squeeze out all of the repetition. Right. There's no direct repetition. Instead, there's a constant transformation of ideas, and in other words, you strip out all of the redundancy, you squeeze it out, and then all that's left is well, the heart of the matter, I suppose, but without any of the things that make a piece conventionally understandable for most listeners.
Yeah. You need things to hook onto.
Right.
You need to it needs to draw you into the thing you're trying to understand, trying to comprehend. Which is, in some cases it's sort of conventional harmonies or whatever it is.
Well, let's relate this to your own creative pursuits, because one of the things that was very interesting about the reaction to our last discussion was that there were a lot of viewers who were very curious about your compositions, which are basically impossible to find.
Yeah.
You can't, they don't turn up on YouTube. So there's a lot of people who are curious about that. I'm hoping we can include a short excerpt from one of your pieces in this discussion so people can actually hear what it sounds like. But so you've spoken a little bit about this, but maybe we could go into greater depth. So your own pieces have been partially an attempt to come to terms with these problems of notation.
Well, they are a succession of tryouts. I mean, trying out ideas. When I first started out, I got rid of durations. I mean, it was as if my first proper piece. I mean, my first proper piece is a piece for piano roll. I wrote it. It's in piano roll notation.
Piano roll notation.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was before I went to the academy.
When you say piano roll,
I mean lines. I actually made a piano roll.
Oh, in the sense of Nancaro.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So you actually cut the holes out.
I actually cut the holes.
Oh, okay.
There is a score, which looks the same that I transcribed the score onto the piano roll. So after that, the next step, I wrote a piece in space-time notation, so classical lines, means, duration. After that, I was unsatisfied with that because it was uncontrollable and it was illegible, technically illegible. After that, I went back to the standard system, 5-line systems with note heads. But basically, there are beats without duration and grace notes in between. So it's conducted, so you have to follow the conductor, but it's extremely flexible. But that's the point at which I went back to standard notation, but without triplets and without tempo. And
what's that piece called?
There's the probability of harmony.
The probability of harmony. Okay.
And there's a companion piece called Possible Developments. Which is. The score is now available. I've had it. There's now a PDF of it. Oh, the probability of harmony is also available. That's a mobile. Both of those pieces are mobile pieces in the sense we were just talking about. But I've now made versions, fixed versions of them. They're no longer mobile, but they're still the same. You still have to follow the conductor and you have to do what he does.
So what's the instrumentation of these pieces?
The probability of harmony is for clarinet, alto flute, and a tape. There's a tape, which is a kind of drone, which decides how long the piece is. When it starts, the piece starts, and when it stops, the piece stops. Okay. So the piece just decides when the piece is going to the boundaries. Okay. But it's unimportant. It's very quiet. But the music is for the flute and the clarinet and a conductor. Okay. Very very small piece. It's actually one of my best pieces. But there is no recording. Somebody should play it.
Well, this is the thing. If anybody watching this is in a position to play some of these pieces, wouldn't that be amazing?
They're quite easy.
These pieces are crying out to be played. So I hope somebody watching this will express some interest.
I should say about the tape for probability of harmony is I've now put it on an MP4 file. There's now an MP4 file of it, and it's played very, very quietly and can be played on a laptop. You don't need a complicated sound system. It's played so quietly that you can't hear it when they're playing, when the instruments are playing.
Well, surely a piece for clarinet, flute, and tape can be played by somebody.
Absolutely. I mean, it was played quite a lot in the early 70s.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's a well-tried piece, but there just happens to be no recording of it.
Okay, so it's overdue for a revival.
Yeah.
we'll just put that out there for anybody who's watching.
Possible developments. There's a companion piece, which is for 4 instruments, for actually arbitrary instruments, but there's a recording, I think it's flute, 2 cor anglais and bassoon.
Okay.
It's alto flute. It's low instruments, and there's no tape. And that piece had a very good recording performance by the Lontano Ensemble at Wigmore Hall in London in the 80s when I made a version of it. That was originally also a mobile score, but it's no longer a mobile score. So it's that's also very performable.
So is that recording available? Can we hear that?
I do have a recording of it, and the score is available. I'm not sure about copyright problems. If I asked if I could put it on my website, and the answer that I would have to pay something to the performers. But I'm not sure whether I want to do that. Well, I think what I do think is that recordings are important for the performers. So if somebody wants to play this piece, then they will get a copy of the old recording, so they can learn the performance practice.
Right. Okay.
And I think any piece of mine that is performed should be played at least 3 times. I'm not interested in a single performance, and that was it, because I think the performers need to learn. They need to feel the piece, and you can only feel the piece properly if you've played it a couple of times.
Yeah.
So I'm not really interested in sort of just one performance.
Right. Well, I'm absolutely with you on that. I think that composers can be a lot more forthright, I think, about asking for that. Because if you just accept the conditions that are offered to you...
I mean, they're not paying any commissions or anything, and I don't want any money for it.
Right.
So, I mean, why don't they just play it a bit more? I mean, that's it.
Well, I suspect that's one of the aspects of the new music world that I think doesn't function optimally. And a lot of people are aware of this. And I suspect moving forward that we're going to see more repeat performances of pieces and hopefully more selective programs, so that we don't necessarily have always 5 or 6 premieres in a row, which is very difficult for performers and for audiences to manage.
Yeah.
But rather a smaller number of premieres, but very carefully presented and prepared.
And properly played. Okay, do you want to go on with my progression of my pieces?
Yes, please. Yeah.
The probability of harmony and possible developments. They use single note heads. The probability of harmony has 6 beats in a bar, but the beats are at different lengths. They have note heads. Right? There's a proper crotchet note head. And there are 6 of them in each bar, and in between the crotchet note heads, there are things that look like grace notes. But you phrase the way you think you want to play this phrase. The durations are not determined except between the alto flute player and the conductor. So you play voluptuously. You phrase properly. Okay, then the next big moment is Vectors, Donner Eschinger in 1978. That was an experiment. I've just made a big documentation about that piece, which is now online. It defines the duration symbols, the duration classes, as classes of duration. Also, let's say a crotchet is something between 1 second and 2 seconds. And a quaver is done between half a second and 1 second, and a semi-quaver is between a quarter second and half a second. So that was designed like that, and I tried to work that out. Worked quite well, but in the end I was unhappy with it because I discovered that nobody can hear that. It's too vague. I mean, you don't. If I play a note that's sort of 1.5 seconds, it doesn't. The connect is wrong, and so in that piece I discovered that there is a difference between what's actually on the page and what you actually hear. So in Beyond the Symbolic, which comes the next big piece, which is Ensemble Intercontemporain, the symbols are defined purely graphically. So it depends on how much music there is on the page, but on a particular page, there is an amount of space that can be allocated to a crotchet symbol, which is double the size of the amount of space you can allocate to an eighth symbol. So that it's all defined purely in terms of space. So it's optical music, if you like. I mean, it's only when you read it, you can read what it's supposed to sound like. But what you're reading is actually putting it into practice is something else. And that was where I discovered how to distinguish between space and time. Because the score, but on paper, you can't actually describe the time. But once you get from paper to computer files, then you can start defining the time on a different level inside the symbols. That you can describe. I mean, when I now compose a piece in terms of millisecond durations, and define the symbols in terms of, let's say, a crotchet symbol can be anything between, let's say, 500 and 1,000 milliseconds. Well, let's say this crotchet is 720 milliseconds. Then that means it's a crotchet and it's not a quaver, right? So that means that I can transcribe the temporal information into graphical notation and present the graphical notation. And that means because the crotchet is defined as something between 500 and 1,000 milliseconds, I can make a different version of the same score, right? You understand? Then that's where I've got to now.
Okay. So listening to you describe this, one thing strikes me, which is that all of these pieces were written for different ensembles in different countries. And what you may have lacked at the time was a sort of stable of performers that you could work with, because the ideas that you're describing...
I've never really tried to be a conventional composer. What I'm interested in is getting the the concepts right in the notation.
Right.
I could work with you, for example, if you wanted to write a composition in which you described it, you transferred all your durations into milliseconds, which you probably do. Then I could transcribe it into the notation I'm using, and then it would be part of this eco structure. You know, I mean, I'm not the one that's trying to be a composer. But if somebody wants to be a composer, then they have to use this kind of system to get their performance practice into the performers' minds before they play it.
Okay, so you're suggesting that the works are an attempt to work out a new principle of notation, in a sense.
Yeah.
But even so, because of the comparative novelty of your approach, what I think that requires, nevertheless, is some degree of consistency in terms of the performers, right? So that you can work with people over months, over years, so that they can produce really.
Well, no, I think that the notation I'm using is actually standard notation without all the frills.
Right.
So any performer can actually read it, but it's what they do which is important for the composer.
Right.
And a composer a composer who writes the piece, all he needs is the software. He or she needs the software to do that. I mean, that's what they're now doing with Sibelius. But the problem with Sibelius and the other conventional softwares is that they don't think in terms of milliseconds. They think in terms of subdivisions of time, which is a problem. It's quite possible to presumably in Sibelius you can write a phony hour piece and then rub out all the triplets, and you would end up with something very similar to what I'm talking about. But what I'm saying is that you need to give the composers flexibility in order to move on. You need they need to be able to compose what the temporal things they want to hear, and then to transcribe that into something that musicians can read that reminds them what it was supposed to sound like.
I see. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
You understood?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I think so. But we'll of course provide a link to your website on the video description, so people can see what the scores look like.
There was one more piece after Beyond Symbolic on Paper, which is the Innocent Bystander. That extends the idea of flexible of pitches to microtones. But it's okay. We don't need to talk about that. And after that, my first piece is the Study One, which is online.
Okay. So that one we can hear.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And I'm hoping again I can twist your arm and get you to provide some short audio samples that we can include in this
sure.
in this discussion. But anyway, okay. So as I mentioned at the outset of our conversation, our previous podcast elicited quite a reaction, and there were many questions from viewers that you kindly took the time to address. One of the things that came up that people are very curious about is the nature of your working relationship with Stockhausen, and also the way that it ultimately ended, which we briefly alluded to last time. But I wonder if you could tell us a few more insights as to what Stockhausen was like. You've mentioned to me privately that he was very secretive or very closed in terms of how he did his work. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about that.
Stockhausen belonged to the same group of composers as Beethoven. I mean, it goes the idea of the genius who has an inspiration and comes down from above and gives you the divine inspiration. And before that, composers were more or less lackeys. I mean, they were artisans, they were practitioners. and they were paid by dukes or whoever it was who caused the tune.
Right. So Haydn, for example, was essentially treated the same as any domestic employee.
Yeah.
Right. According to the terms of his employment.
Yeah.
There was no major distinction between him and anyone providing a service.
That's right. Composers were providing a service. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the same was probably true of Monteverdi, in relation to the church.
Right.
And Stockhausen, and from Beethoven, in Beethoven's time, you get this commercialization of the individual. Beethoven, he earned his living from his publishers. I mean, his publisher they were selling sheet music, and presumably Beethoven was paid by rich patrons and by his publisher, and his publisher needed to have a selling point. I mean, they needed to sell their heroes a good way to get bums on seats and get people to buy scores. Mm-hmm. You know, we're all waiting for the next Beethoven sonata.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And so we earn money by promoting this idea of this genius, which is okay. And if you write a lot, you get better. Mm-hmm. And if you can earn your living doing that, then you get better. Your experience is everything. Mm-hmm. And I think Stockhausen his generation still belonged to that generation where you don't talk about the murky business of money, and you don't talk about the practicalities of actually getting your scores out to the public.
Well, he used to complain quite a lot, especially after the 70s, about the relative lack of funding. Well, his projects were obviously very expensive.
But he never earned his living from scores. No, I mean that was a losing project. Mm-hmm. But he thought it was important, and I think it's important. But that was not where he earned his money. And Stockhausen earned his money by being a practical performer and taking commissions. But the image of the genius who stands above it all is now over since the internet, and we now no longer believe in people who are above it all. It's a much more egalitarian society, and if you try to be a genius on the internet, you quickly get drummed down. And today, it's all about what you can do. Can you do what you say you can, or can't you? And are you a practitioner, or are you not? And hiding. I mean, I'm now getting to what we were talking about. This levels of secrecy. When I was working for him, I was kept out of sight, and nobody ever talked about me. Nobody ever asked him how his philog worked. Mm. No, it's. I'm not complaining, but I'm just saying that that's how it was. He had to maintain this outward image of somebody who just presented his scores.
Right, the works just magically appear.
They just magically appear.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But actually, there is a process that goes into that and a lot of hard work.
Well, there's something to be said for that, because it's necessary for artists to cultivate a kind of aura around the work that they're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But today it's less about aura than about convincing performances, and convincing by what you do, rather than what the salespeople.
But don't you think on some level the audience wants they want these remote, incomprehensible figures, in the same sense that moviegoers want movie stars, right? They want these idealized, impossible people.
Yeah, I mean, this is pop culture, isn't it? This is pop culture. Sure. I mean, this is the way pop culture went. But I think that's much less than it was now. Than it was in the 60s, 70s, 80s.
Well, it's not tenable anymore because everything's exposed. And,
that's right. Well, that's what I'm saying. The internet has exposed everything, and it's no longer. There's no point in covering up your dirty washing. I mean, it's honourable thing to do to actually work. I mean, yeah,
Right. Sure.
You know.
Yeah.
So that changed with the internet, and during my time with Stockhausen, as I say, he kept me under wraps. Whenever anybody came to dinner, anybody important, I would have to disappear.
How did that make you feel at the time?
I understood it.
You understood it?
Yeah. I mean, that was part of his job. I mean, part of his modus operandi was to present this, and I didn't want to get in the way.
So you weren't feeling like Cinderella, sort of locked away in the cellar, not able to come down, you know?
Well, in a way, yes. But what would I do as his copyist? I mean, if he's having an important dinner with somebody from the VDR, or with an old friend Kontarski or something, I don't want to get in the way.
Okay.
You know, it's not. I mean, I don't want to feel that I'm getting. So I was okay. That's fine. I got a few mentions in his texter. I mean, the books. If you've got those, there are a few photos of me.
Well, I don't have them because they're too expensive.
Yeah.
The one thing, so I ordered a bunch of CDs from the Verlag when I was a teenager, the first 6 or 7, which are amazing. And then I also bought at tremendous expense, and this was complicated for me to manage, but I bought the facsimile edition of Gesang der Jünglinge, which is an amazing publication. Yeah. But it cost an absolute bloody fortune.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with these Verlag things, is that university libraries maybe can afford them, but for individuals, you're not going to...
Yeah. But I mean, he's covering his costs. I mean, they're just expensive things.
Of course, yeah.
So
fair enough.
You know,
that's why I don't have the complete text of Stockhausen. So
I must show you a few scores. Okay. So that was one level of secrecy, and then there's another level of secrecy going down, which is quite interesting. You asked about his state of mind with his or about his the sources for his inspiration. He would never talk about that. He would always leave people guessing. He would say, I'm obviously, occasionally he would have a dream and then realize a dream, and say, I'm realizing I dreamt this and I'm going to do it. But his inner, where his inspiration came from, that was something completely sacrosanct. Nobody was allowed to go in there. And he did a slightly layer up from that. When he was asked why Licht was called Licht in Japan after the premiere of Jaroslav, he said it was named after the Japanese train.
Really?
Yeah, and which goes the fast train from Osaka to Tokyo or something. So he deliberately obfuscates. He deliberately smudges over things so that people are left guessing. And he won't answer some questions he just doesn't answer, which is very good because it's
shrewd.
It makes people think, or it makes them turn off.
Yeah.
I mean, but there is something about when you're an artist. There are some things that you shouldn't talk about, and that you can't talk about because you don't know the answer yourself. When you ask me about his attitude to Urantia or something like that, it's very difficult to answer that because that's inside a black box inside him, which is quite fair enough. That's where the outside world stops. And so there's that level of secrecy as well. I mean, you can't always explain everything. And I think that's very important.
Yeah, well, I agree with that very strongly. It's one of the reasons why I don't really talk about my own work
Yeah.
in public. I talk about other people's work.
Yeah,
And I'm
right.
happy to do that.
All right, right.
But I'm often asked about my own pieces, and I'm disinclined to.
Yeah.
It's not. I don't want to be rude or anything, but yeah, some things. It's better if they remain off limits, I think.
That's right.
Yeah.
Some things it's better to keep quiet about.
Yeah, yeah,
And Stockhausen was a master at that.
yeah.
Also, even living with him for 25 years, I didn't get in there. That's something beyond. So his private intuitions were off track, off limits.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But I think as an artist, they are visible. I mean, you can make your own decide for yourself what you think his inner motives, inner workings are.
Mm-hmm.
Often has to do with private people he knew, but you have to know who he knew at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, in Momento, it's all about Mary Baumeister.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But that's fairly obvious.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then there are other things. There are explicit places where he mentions particular people. And in the music boxes for Tierkreis, he thought very deeply about particular people who had particular birthdays before writing the piece for their birthday.
Oh, I see.
And I was part of Fish.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. And the people like Peter Edfish were also involved. I mean, also in his mind when he was talking about these pieces, and they were originally dedicated to these people who had particular birthdays.
Uh-huh.
So that's a specific place where he does that.
Right. So he might not have said that explicitly.
Well, he actually did say that in those verses, but how he gets from a particular person to a particular piece of music is completely nobody knows.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, Boulez in that sense had a very different attitude. He was more sort of explicitly materialist when he was describing his work. Stockhausen, of course, was interested in mysticism and the divine, but Boulez was a materialist, I think, through and through, and he would describe his works in very abstract materialist terms. That don't really tell you anything at all about his inner life or about the inner life or the inspiration behind the works.
Yeah. My own inner life is also not irrelevant. I've always thought, in the preface to Beyond the Symbolic, I say there's a little poem that says that more is, but beyond words, will be misunderstood.
Mm.
And I believe that there are things that we are not equipped to understand. Recently, I've become very impressed by a philosophical direction called analytical idealism. I'm really an idealist. I'm not a materialist, because I believe that space and time are brain strategies. They're
an artifact of our perceptual system.
They're an artifact of our perceptual system. And I don't believe that all are. I mean, we know very well that there are different animals that have different perceptual capabilities. I mean, some birds can see the magnetic field, and so we don't know which dimensions we don't see. Mm-hmm. So I think materialism is baloney.
Mm. I would agree with you. I think that's one of the major limitations of the Boulezian project and of his worldview. So
and so that was part of my reaction to Stockhausen. I mean, Stockhausen had he's got a lot of stick for his homemade Michael, Eva, Lucifer trilogy, gods, these parameters. But im Grunde, sorry, I'm German. But basically, he was simply not a materialist. And I believe that this surface veneer of his so-called private mythology is just something that he could hold on to actually produce something concrete.
Yeah.
And that under the surface, he was simply not a materialist.
That seems clear. Yeah. Already in Gruppen, you remember what he wrote at the end of the score? Deo gratis.
Yeah.
You can't imagine Boulez doing that.
No.
At the same time.
No. I think Stockhausen was obviously brought up as a devout Catholic. I'm not a Catholic, but and I don't believe in. I mean, I suppose I'm an agnostic about the deity, but I think it's very highly unlikely that there is some kind of superhuman intelligence actually controlling everything. But that doesn't. The answer to that question doesn't really affect me. I read this morning. I was reading my own notes this morning, and there's an interesting quote by Karl Marx about religion. I don't know whether I can really bring it. Karl Marx wanted to make religion irrelevant by changing the mode of production, by changing the context. He wanted to change the context in order that religion would just become irrelevant. And I think that's more or less what I'm doing. What my philosophy is, that I think that it's possible to change the context, and that thereby the question of whether there is an ultimate deity or not is for me, it doesn't really change things one way or the other. So the question doesn't really arise. But I do believe in something beyond. I do believe that we don't know everything.
Well, that seems obvious, given the limits of our perception and the manner in which we are by definition incapable of perceiving whatever reality is outside of the framework of our own perceptions. But of course, there are things that we cannot possibly.
There is a thing called scientific method, which you do experiments, you try things out, and if they work, they work, and if they don't, they don't, and if they do work, then you've found something more about out about the world, and that's very satisfying. But there's no reason to think that you're actually going to find out the ultimate answer.
Right.
But there is progress. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be happier, or everybody's going to be happier, but things change. And if you're a composer, you need to understand why you're going to fail. If you try to become another Stockhausen, it's important to try to understand art, and where art is going, which is what you're doing.
Well, it's not coming directly through me, but through the conversations that I have with other people, and then hopefully that through that process there will be some kind of a picture that will emerge that will have some measure of cohesion.
Yeah.
But this is one of the reasons why I like to have not only composers on the program, but also visual artists, photographers, poets, and so on, to get a broader picture of.
I think the broader picture is extremely important at this time, because the whole. There are a lot of systems, academia and the scientific establishment and universities. All these systems are in flux at the moment, and I think it's very important that we find some common thread to know what it's meaningful to do. And how we're going to survive. I mean,
yes,
how art, what it means for art to survive.
Absolutely,
I mean, and whether art is going to. I mean, there's a very important debate between of the two cultures in the 50s, between the divide between the sciences and the arts, and I think that problem is something which is now coming to a head, and art is something you try things out and you make beautiful objects in order to, but you don't need to prove anything in the arts. Either it's beautiful or it's not.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
You know.
That's right. Do you think that's an objective quality, beauty? Is there?
Well, for me, art is my working definition of art is the expression of insight, but your insights, you don't know why or why you think something. Mm-hmm. You believe, you seem to survive thinking these things, or your insight is that. If you write poetry, you're expressing your insights about words, about feelings or meanings or whatever it is. So I think insight is an important concept in all the arts. You have to. It's an expression of. It's part of what technique is.
Right. Well, in order to have insights, you have to have an individual vantage point, and the ability to see beyond the cliches and the established ways of doing things.
And I know we haven't got much more time, but that goes directly to artificial intelligence and the debate about what artificial intelligence is. Because the more you know, the more you're aware of, the more use you can make of an artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is an amplification of knowledge, of experience. Mm-hmm. You can't ask proper questions unless you've got a really good basic knowledge. Mm-hmm. So the more knowledge you have, the more use you can make of artificial intelligence. And if you're stupid and you haven't learned anything, then you're just going to fall behind. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The gap between the intelligentsia and the non-intelligentsia is going to get bigger.
Right. So AI is not going to make you any smarter.
No, it's not going to make you any smarter if you're stupid or if you're ignorant. Mm-hmm. Ignorant is a better word. Mm-hmm. If you're ignorant, you're not going to learn much more from artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But if you have a speciality and you know a lot about some particular sphere of knowledge, then you can make very good use of artificial intelligence, and you can progress.
It can dramatically accelerate the learning process.
Dramatic, and it can create communities between people who know about the same sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So far, and who knows where it's going to go in 5 years or even 1 year, but so far it seems like a net benefit. I mean, I use ChatGPT all the time. Mm-hmm. I find it enormously beneficial. Mm-hmm. I recognize, of course, that ChatGPT and Grok and all of these other platforms can get things wrong, and they're only as good as...
You have to know. You have to be able to check.
Yes, of course, because they only know as much as the data that they're trained on.
Yeah.
And then there are some fairly basic things, mathematical things, for example, that they're not able to do. Mm-hmm. There are certain tasks that they're completely incapable of. So, for example, if you say to ChatGPT, generate a palindromic poem that doesn't use the letter E.
Yeah.
Any human poet would understand those constraints and work within them. It would be very difficult, of course. Yeah. But ChatGPT isn't able to do that because what it will do is search through its database, I suppose, for texts that do something similar. Mm-hmm. But it won't actually generate a poem that fulfills those constraints. It can't do that. But anyway, so it has limitations and weaknesses and so on. But it's enormously useful if you are very clear about what you of the knowledge you're seeking.
Yeah, you have to know to ask the right questions, and if you're asking them at the perimeter of your experience, mm-hmm. and you have a lot of experience, mm-hmm. then you will get some very interesting answers.
Absolutely.
So that's very interesting. But it will lie unashamedly.
Yes, that's right.
so I'm using Copilot in Visual Studio to program with, and I asked it, how can I store this latest chat? Because it gave me a long answer and I wanted to save it for later. And it said, well, load it into the browser and then you can open it and read it again. But then I asked it, well, how can I open this in a browser? Well, the browsers open files but I can't give you the URL. I can't give you the address, so you can't actually open it in the file in the browser in the first place. So opening it in a browser is a non-starter. So you sometimes run into sort of circles.
Yeah, one thing that I find very strange with these platforms is that they will respond to me using the first person pronoun. So I'll say to ChatGPT, for example, here's a decision point that I'm struggling with, and here are the options, and here's the context, and it will start answering by saying, well, I think ...
Yeah.
And then I always think, well, you know you're not an individual, you're not a person, and yet you're using the pronoun I in your response.
Well, it's a kind of entity, isn't it? And I suppose the entity is.
Yeah, I suppose. And there are people such as there's a channel run by a young British guy called Alex O'Connor who actually has conversations with ChatGPT where he tries to corner it and say, now wait a minute, you're not, and it's very, very interesting. So anyway,
well, that's the frontier.
That's the frontier. So that there are lots of reasons for optimism. I think you would have to conclude that this is the best time in history to be alive.
Absolutely. Yeah, highly interesting.
It's such an amazing, fascinating time.
Yeah, absolutely.
To exist. And on that note, thank you again for making the journey a second time to Kale.
It's been my pleasure, really.
And I always enjoy getting a chance to talk to you. And and we'll put a link in the video description.
Yeah, I'll talk to you about files and scores and things.
Sounds good. Yeah. Okay. Thank you again.
Okay. Thanks very much for having me.